So then while we're still in the meditative mode, we'll kind of shift our focus from just a couple minutes from the breath to our motivation for today, for this class, but also for our lives. Particularly just we'll take a few minutes to focus on the motivation of love, compassion, and bodhicitta. So we'll remember, like it's a contemplative meditation. So we'll bring to mind how, you know, I want to be happy, don't want to suffer. And that way, actually, uh, all others are the same as me. Like everyone I'm close with and care for, also, I know, right, wants to be happy, doesn't want to suffer. And even strangers, right? People I don't know, the same. Animals, also the same. All sentient beings are like that. Even people I don't like, they're the same as me and wanting to be happy and not wanting to suffer. Some recognition that we all have that in common. But the minimum, right, my purpose in my life is not to increase the suffering of myself or others, but is to help others and also myself to be happier, have less suffering. So we take a moment to actually empathize through our both reasoning and imagination to really feel that recognition. All the people in my neighborhood want to be happy, don't want to suffer. People in my neighborhood who I like, but also anybody who might be annoying to me. Maybe I'm annoying to them also, but they want to be happy and don't want to suffer just like me. All the people in my family or my work or we're all the same in that way. All the people, everybody in the country, this country, everybody in this world is the same. And when anybody, including myself, like over focuses or focuses on our own well-being to the exclusion of others, so we become self-preoccupied or self-centered, as if we're the center of the world. And that's how we actually increase. That's one of the main ways we increase our own and others' suffering. We can actually see that, right? If we contemplate. If I go around thinking I'm the center of the world, and others go around thinking they're the center of the world, then we come into conflict. We cause ourselves and others every kind of misery, right? Everything from arguments in a family, between friends, up to war, famine, disease. All those things are caused or made worse by the kind of unrealistic, self-centered attitude. Whereas love and compassion are causes of happiness, actually. You can see that, right? Whether you look like just in your own mind, the moments you feel love, your mind is more peaceful. If we think on the level of like a relationship, friendship, family relationship, when people are being overly self-centered, they cause each other suffering. When people are open-hearted, loving, compassionate towards themselves and each other, then like on the level of family, on the level of friend, on the level of neighborhood, all the way up to between nations. It's the cause of happiness. From Buddhist perspective, same thing, right? In this life or in future lives, it's the same. If we're self-obsessed or self-centered or overly and unrealistically self-focused, we're unhappy in this life, and that's how we create bad karma that harms ourselves and others. Because actually, love is the very definition of good karma. So through love, we're happy in the moment. We build happy relationships. We create positive karma that leads to happiness in the future and positive habits of our mind and heart. So everything good in our own lives, in our relationships, in the broader world comes about through love and compassion. So we decide, I dedicate myself. I dedicate my life to love. I dedicate my life to compassion, to kindness. And then, like, purpose of studying together, the perfection of wisdom is also that. There's no other reason to study the perfection of wisdom other than to lead others and also myself to happiness, freedom from suffering. The ultimate, in Buddhist view, the ultimate expression of that is enlightenment. What is enlightenment? It's just the ultimate expression of achieving one's own and others and helping others achieve their freedom from suffering and happiness and well-being. So I'm striving for the ultimate expression of love and compassion, which is enlightenment itself. That's the purpose of my life, purpose of my existence. Is the ultimate expression of love and compassion. Okay, with that in mind, then we'll recite the verse we often recite. Okay. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. Nice to see everybody. And this thing, like been doing the last couple of times, I'll just start just by checking in with people for any, last night, like the 2 classes ago, I had suggested, like, just, we've been talking about the object of negation, right? In emptiness, for emptiness meditation, I had suggested, trying to, like, notice your own experience in relation to that. And then last class, I suggested, because we had done that practice in relation to that line in the Heart Sutra, right? Form is empty, emptiness is form, emptiness is not other than form, form also is not other than emptiness. And remember last class, like, for form, we used the example of water as something to meditate on the emptiness, a form. But then I just said, I'd ask you guys just to play with that, experiment with that, notice in your life, right, how you experience either your sense of self or your sense of forms, and then to experiment with contemplating emptiness in relation to those things. And I mentioned Tendar, where he's using to a large extent, at least the commentary by Tendar Larampa. And I mentioned that quote where he says, I'll read the quote again. He says, therefore, analyze from various perspectives using the examples that appear easily to the mind, right? So easily to the mind means whatever is in your own real life. It's not something abstract, right? And then he says, and when dependent arising appears as the meaning of emptiness at its best. So it's just this idea of kind of contemplating emptiness, and he and many other lamas point out that when you get, the closer you get to correct understanding of emptiness, the more emptiness and dependent arising appear as synonyms, right, as the meaning of each other. You know, that dependent arising is the meaning of emptiness, and emptiness is the meaning of dependent arising. So that's a guideline on how to know if you're on track. But anyway, there's no pressure. Nobody has to share. But I always want to give time at the beginning, a couple minutes. Does anybody have any questions or experiences or comments about that contemplation before we go into new material?
I chose my eyeglasses, but I found that I thought too much about it, so I couldn't really get anywhere with it except contemplating them when I don't have them on. They're completely different than when I have them on. But that's really, I didn't get very far with it. But
how are they different? Say just say what your experience.
I was thinking too much how to do this, and the only thing I could find out was when I didn't have them on, they're a completely different object than when I have them on.
How are they different object in your experience?
They're not part of my experience.
That's interesting.
But I found I thought too much how to do it, and I didn't really experience it. I thought too much.
Well, that's okay. Yeah, just as great. I want to say, like, to me, it's great to try, you know, to begin. I mean, that's how we all have to begin, right? Is to, I think it's great that, like, you know, because like Tender Larpa says, right, using examples that appear easily to your mind. So your glasses are something that are always there, so it appear easily to your mind. You know, and then I just want to say, make a comment, like, you know, one way to start then is to think of a moment like when for anything, I mean, I'm using the glasses as the example, but it would be any object, right? To think of a time, just to get an idea of the object of negation, is like to think of a time when the glasses seem like they exist in a very concrete way. You know, it might be like if you can't find them, or if you really need them, or if they broke, or something, you know, whatever you can think of it. I mean, it depends on your real life, but to think of some example where they appear in a particularly vivid way, as like that's them, like you're grasping at them, right? And then once you do that, right? I mean, there are many ways to think about emptiness, but if we use the example from water, it was looking at the parts, right? So one way to do it then is just to say, if the glasses exist in that way, you know, if I, like, you know, I know for myself, if I can't find something, sometimes it seems like, oh, it seems like it exists in a very kind of concrete way, and you have to find it. And then, so you would think of that way it appears to my mind, right, as this concrete thing. And then you could sort of just simply analyze, does that exist separate from the parts? No, that's easy, right? Whereas the glasses can't exist, they don't exist somewhere separate from, like, the little screw and the, you know, what's it called? The part that goes over your ear, or the lens, or the frame, you know, the central part of the frame. There's no glasses that exist apart from those, right? And then do the glasses exist on any one of those parts? Right? Like if you just had one lens, would that be your glasses? You know, if you just had one of those little tiny screws, if you had just one of those, would those be your glasses? You know, and then you say, well, it doesn't exist separate from any of the parts, and it doesn't exist on or within any of the parts, right? And you could, I mean, we don't need to get that. You could go into greater detail, right down to the subatomic level of the matter. But in this case, it's quite easy, isn't it? You just keep it simple, right? If it doesn't exist, that thing seems very solid, but if it doesn't exist apart from the parts of the glasses, and it doesn't exist in or on any of those parts of the glasses, then in what way does it exist? You know, and what you start to have hopefully what happens, like, actually, I was thinking about this, like what they say actually is that, you know, if we're not familiar, they were pointing us out, like, and I mean, we're all in a way not, I mean, even lamas at the beginning are not familiar, you know, so it's not like, I don't mean in some negative way, but when we're not yet really familiar with emptiness, it'll almost seem disturbing, like, well, then did the glasses exist? Or, you know, there should almost be some feeling of like, feels uncomfortable, this feels weird, or this feels bizarre or something. And that's a good sign, that you're starting to kind of, it's just beginning, right? That we're starting to kind of feel, because it should be more than just intellectual, right? Where you're starting to feel like, wow, the way I always perceive this, my glasses in this case, or whatever it would be, actually isn't how they exist, right? That they don't exist in that solid way. I'm just using solid as a kind of gross example here. But the same would apply to any object, right? Your car, your whatever, whatever it would be, right? That you have to first find that solid way that it seems to exist to you, or that, we say self-existent way, or existing from its own side. And then when you check the parts, that's a very, that's a common thing, right? So it doesn't exist separate from the, take example of a car, right? The car doesn't exist. You can't say my car exists separate from all of its parts, right? That'd be silly. But then if you analyze the parts, there's no car on any of the parts. Right? And so that's where we start to get closer to dependent arising, right? So how does it exist? And then you start to say the glasses. Well, they exist merely labeled, right? On the parts, on the basis of the appearance of parts, right? But there's nothing from its own side that's glasses. Right? And so anyway, that's enough. I mean, if you that's a way to, so I guess what I'm saying is with any object, those are the steps. First, you have to kind of find, how do I grasp it as if it sort of exists in some solid or real or from its own side or intrinsic way. And that's why this is the easiest way to start, is to say, well, with the parts meditation, right? Does it exist completely separate from the parts? Or is it findable, and which is not, it doesn't, right? That's easy, right? Any physical object, if you think of your car, right? There's no way it exists separate from all the parts of the car, right? And then if it did, then you'd say, oh, I'll buy that car that exists separate from all the parts, right? It would be kind of silly, wouldn't it? But then if you search each of the parts, right? There's no way, right? Like, the one wheel is not a car, right? The carburetor is not a car. A steering wheel is not a car, right? And so it starts to get almost disturbing, though, where it's like, well, it seems like the car is there, right? But then as you analyze it, it starts to seem as if, for experientially, it'll start to seem almost like, well, if it doesn't exist separate from the parts and it's not findable, it doesn't exist on any of the parts, there should come almost a feeling, is my point. And that's a good sign. That means you're getting closer, that it's just the beginning, right? But that we're getting closer to sort of recognizing that the way we grasp at things as existing is not how they exist. Doesn't mean they don't exist at all, right? But they exist in this, one way you could say is, how do they exist? Dependently, right? That's what Tendar Laram was saying, right? Dependent arising. And ultimately what we come to is, right, that they depend, actually, and I'll mention this too, just because it's good to think about. When we say dependent arising, right? I think I mentioned this once before, but ordinarily in Buddhism, we say there are all three are true. In other words, it's not that these are not contradictory, they're all true, but we say there are three levels on which one can think about dependent arising or dependence. One is causal dependence, right? In other words, a thing is arose due to causes and conditions. That's true, isn't it? Right? A car, for example, or glasses arose because they were produced, right? Somebody made them, invented them, and then made them. That's one level of dependent arising. Then the second level, which is subtler, these go in subtlety, so that's the grossest level, is things arise due to causes and conditions. Right? Then the second level of dependent arising is dependence upon parts. That's the one I just talked about, right? Whereas that the glasses, it's not that they don't exist, but how do they exist? They exist dependent upon parts, right? And they don't exist on any of the parts, but they don't exist separate from the parts. So they depend upon the parts. Right? And then the third, which is the most subtle level of dependent arising, is dependent upon labeling, right? Dependent upon name, right? And so you could do that. My point is like just taking and again, you just pick one in any given meditation, right? I gave the example when I did it of parts, but because that's easier. The most subtle one we shouldn't start with, but you eventually would come to, is dependent upon designation, dependent on a label. And that's the most subtle of all the levels of dependent arising. But anyway, so my point is that you can, so you can pick one of those, right? You can pick causal, and I would suggest don't start with labeling. That comes later, start with either the causal dependent arising or dependent upon parts. And dependent on parts would be, again, with the glasses, just keep it simple, right? Here's how I grasp at them. You know, you can imagine if I sat on my glasses, right? That'd be very disturbing. You know, I think, oh no, if I heard the crunch when I sat on them, then immediately I would think this, oh no, I'm so upset. But I'm just giving an example, so you might imagine that. And you think, okay, those glasses that seem like they're very solid and important and exist from their own side, do they exist as one with the part? Do they exist separate from the parts? No. And then are they findable on the parts? Is any of those parts glasses? Right? You start to realize the glasses, and there's a gross level, right? But they don't exist as what's the word? One way of saying is they don't exist independently. They don't exist as a unitary, singular thing. Right? And that's clear, isn't it? Just like last time we said, water doesn't exist as a singular thing, right? Because it's made up of hydrogen and oxygen. You know, glasses are made up of parts. Okay. Anyway, any other comments or questions or thoughts before?
More.
Yeah, Linda.
I'm gonna. You know, I've heard your wonderful explanations so many times, and I've heard them other ways as well. But I can't get past why, if something is, I've heard, you know, about the parts and so forth. I don't understand, this is why something can't exist, even if it's a collective, like you know, a composite. So, I mean, I can't get past that, you know. I understand the parts and breaking it down, you know, intellectually.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, I think to myself, so what? Even so,
Keep going. Say a little more. Yeah. So, like, give an example.
This is how dense I am, but I'm admitting it.
No, this is good.
Yeah. No. Anything. You know, a table, a chair, anything. You know. Yes. Your wonderful explanations about parts and particles, and I get that, but to me, it's like I still don't understand why it couldn't exist as a composite, even though it is, you know, in not identified by a particular part of it, like a bicycle. It isn't its wheel, it isn't its pedal. But to me, I can't get beyond, well, okay, so why can't it exist collectively?
Well, actually, let's interact about it for a second, because in one sense, if we talk about, like, you know, we were talking last time a little about like conventional truth and ultimate truth, right?
Yeah, right. I know.
But in one sense, I think you're right. Like, so from a conventional truth perspective, right? Like, I'll use the example of the bicycle.
Okay.
It does exist. You know, in other words, if we say, like, conventionally, does the bicycle exist? You know, and somebody would say, like, I'm just talking about like an ordinary conversation, right? If somebody bought a bicycle that was missing a part, you would say that's not a complete. You know, hey, you know, like if I bought a bicycle and then the person delivered it and it was missing the chain and the pedals, I would say, hey, wait a second, you didn't give me I paid for a whole bicycle, I didn't get my whole bicycle. You know, and then if they delivered the pedals and the chain, I would say, oh, okay, now I've got my bicycle, right? So I mean, in that conventional sort of discussion way, it is a composite. So in other words, so conventionally things do exist, right?
Yeah.
Independent on their parts. So you're right.
Yeah, but even so, I absolutely thank you again for your great explanations. But still, even in the ultimate sense, I don't see. I get the, you know, conventional, but even ultimately, why not? Why, you know?
Well, I guess so let's keep going, because like, I guess if you think of it this way, because in other words, because we have to get, in other words, I'm trying to think how to say this the right way. Like, if you think about the bicycle example, so it existed as a composite, right?
Right.
And I mean, that's the word, I'm using the phrase you used, right? And one point that I think is worth contemplating is, so then does it exist, in what way does it exist as a composite? That's, I guess, what I would ask you, like, how does it exist? Like, or in what sense does it exist as a composite, or how does it exist as a composite? Or what does it mean even to exist as a composite is what I would say. Because now we're starting to get into, that's where, and by the way, with that question I just asked, we're switching from conventional to, that's an ultimate truth question, right? Is, because if you just say, like, in other words, if I just stay on the conventional level, it's like, well, the guy didn't deliver the parts, then all the parts are here, and like, that's okay. But,
Sure.
and that's not an ultimate question. But then if I start to ask the question, well, in what sense does it exist as a composite? How? That's a different question.
Yes.
So I'd ask you that question. So in what way could it exist as a composite? Or how does it exist as a composite?
Are you asking my limited opinion?
Yeah. No, that's perfect. Yeah, exactly.
The same way, the same way it exists conventionally. Why couldn't it exist ultimately in the same way? Why couldn't it be one and the same? It just is. That bicycle is, whether it's composite, as a composite, it is ultimately and conventionally. Why not?
And here's, I guess, what I'm suggesting, and this is like, this is good. This is good questions, I think. I think it's good to think about these things. Right?
And you can stop me whenever you like and go on.
I think it's great, though. So let's go a little further, because I think it's a really good contemplation. And part of what I think, in Madhyamaka thinking, they go towards at this point, and if you're contemplating, is, because you can see, actually, if you contemplate it, right, like a wheel is not a bicycle. A chain, if you just had a chain, that's not a bicycle. If you have a seat, that's not a bicycle, right? That, that's obvious, right?
Right.
And what we start to come towards is that a composite, in a way, right, or a collection. Shantideva in the Guides of the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, he used the word collection, which is the same thing, composite, right?
That's good, collection.
And he said a collection of things. And one thing Shantideva says about that is, he says, if you think about it deeply, this question, right, of like, and what does it mean for a thing to exist as a collection? Mm-hmm. Like, so the bicycle example, right, a collection of parts. If none of the parts, like, they have no, like those parts, right, like a seat that's made of whatever, like even if you think about it, right, like the wheel is made of both metal and rubber, right, or whatever, or air, I guess, right, inside the tire or something. And then, like, the seat might be made of leather or something, or whatever that is. And then the chain is made of some kind of other metal, right, different kind of metal than the wheel. Like, you start to recognize, well, those things have no intrinsic relationship to each other, right? The elements that make those up, right? Rubber versus one kind of metal versus another kind of metal versus, what do you call it? All the different things. And so what Shantideva says is, what you come to eventually is the only way it can exist as a collection or as a composite is independence upon my mind, right? Like, since it's like those things are not self-proclaiming composites, right? Like, the rubber doesn't say I belong with iron, right? And so it's our mind, actually, isn't it? Like, so what makes it a unit, and why is it, like, let's say, if a bicycle is leaning against a pole, right? Like, or leaning against the side of my house, why is that composite? What, like, in other words, why do I draw the line at the edge of the bicycle and not include the house in the composite, right? Or the air around it, or the earth, whatever, the tarmac underneath it, right? In other words, it exists as a kind of isolated, specific, unitary composite. The only way you can come to that is depending on my mind, isn't it? Is there any other way, Lynn? I'll ask you, like just to think about it together. Because is there any other way to sort of say those things are connected as one unit, other than that it's my mind?
So now you're bringing of course, the mind is in all of this. Yeah.
Right, because otherwise, what makes them a unit? Like, what makes the bicycle parts a collection that's somehow actually a bicycle? because those things like the rubber and the metal don't have any more connection than the tarmac or the wood on my house that the bicycle is leaning against, in my example. So what makes that the collection rather than the wood of the house, or the, you know, why not have the rubber and the tarmac be the collection? You know, I'm saying the collection is all the parts of the bicycle, but I'm not including tarmac, and I'm not including wood of the house. So why isolate those things as the unit that's a collection?
Also, how does our mind take the parts of a collection and make it a unit and identify it?
That's what, yeah, that's where.
I isn't that how the mind works? Even though it may make a distorted collection, and it often does, of course. You know, the parts are grouped in a way, in a distorted way. A bicycle is very simple, but I'm talking about our superimpositions of our, you know, onto things. But a bike, just however the mind, I have no idea how the mind works, you know, in making parts into a collection and then identifiable.
But I think that's why I think the bike is a great example. Actually, you know, Chandrakirti in his Madhyamaka Avatar uses a very simple example. He uses an example of a chariot, but it's the same thing. It's a bicycle,
Okay.
really. Right?
Uh-huh.
So I think your example is good. Actually, it just struck me now. And he does the same thing. The wheels of the chariot, the seat, you know, it's the same. The parts are very similar to the parts of a bicycle.
Right. Right.
And part of what we're getting at is like, because that is true, isn't it? Or even from any perspective, forget about Buddhism even, right? Like,
Yeah.
one would have to say, you know, in what way are the parts of a bicycle connected? If you really analyze it in some very deep way, if you really think deeply about it, you would have to end up saying, well, it's my mind. Or is to say that's the collection and not actually would be the siding of the house if it's leaning against the house, or the tarmac, or the air, you know. If I'm saying, no, I'm isolating these parts, the bicycle, you know, but I'm not counting the air outside of it, and I'm not counting the tarmac, and I'm not counting the panels of the whatever, like, of the siding of the house that it's leaning against, I'm saying, no, that's the bicycle. There's no ultimate way to do that other than saying, well, my mind does that, right? Like, my mind labels it in that way. Is that fair point, like, or clear?
Yeah, it's like that book you referenced about the man who mistook his wife for a hat, which I've read.
Yeah.
You know.
Oliver Sacks, yeah.
So yeah, so we can be very, of course, confused, but for some reason we agree that the bike is a bike, a bicycle is a bicycle. Sane people do, or are we sane? Who knows? But anyway. But
go ahead, keep going.
Go on with your talk. Don't. But
No,
I find it very interesting. Thank you.
I think this is great, your question.
Okay.
I just want to raise one more thought, like, is like the part of what I think that that's worth contemplating. So I just want to suggest for everybody, we can contemplate this.
Thank you.
Is that if you think deeply about the question you're raising using the example of a bicycle, you eventually come to the conclusion there's nothing about those parts that from their own side make them a collection. So, you know, it's my mind, you know, that's clear, right? It's my mind that sort of views them as a collection. But then the question that becomes really interesting is, like, and this is the part about the object of negation or ignorance, in a way, which is the cause of suffering, Buddhism is suggesting, right? Is I don't perceive the bicycle, like, I never once perceived the bicycle as only existing because of my mind, or existing totally dependently on my mind.
Oh yeah, right.
But what we're saying is that's how it exists. Like, what Shantideva is getting at when he says this point is, like, so the bicycle exists totally dependent on my mind, but I never perceive the bicycle as if it's totally dependent on my mind. I think it exists out there.
Yeah.
And that's the problem. So it's not saying it doesn't exist as a collection. You know, so just a really good distinction. We're not saying the bicycle doesn't exist as a collection. We're saying it only exists as a collection, as you put it, right? Because, right? Because people agree, you know, like, because there's a social, you know, in other words, because actually, you know, like, in other words, it's specifically a convention to human, right, society or something that if you collect those parts, then you say that's a bicycle. But there's nothing, but it's totally dependent on my mind, and I never perceive it as totally dependent on my mind.
Mm-hmm.
And my point is, it's like, so I think it's really important. So what is it, things, in terms of going back to your original question, it's not that things conventionally aren't collections or composites.
Right.
It's that the idea of the very idea, Shantideva uses the example of, well, anyway, you can use any example, doesn't matter. Everything is like this, that we don't perceive them that way. We perceive them as existing out there, actually existing as an entity, not dependent upon my mind. So I think that's the place to contemplate it. But anyway, do you have other thoughts on that, or other?
Yeah, even I would go to the mind being also. It could exist on its own side, even if it was only created by the mind, or the best way to put that. I don't know. I would still. I'm sorry. That's where I am stuck there, and I will continue to contemplate what you said, but I'm still stuck on ultimate and conventional. Why not the same?
I think it's great. I think it's great that, actually, I'll just say, I think it's great to be stuck there, but yeah, to keep contemplating that then is good.
But I do believe, or I think I've come to the realization to some degree about the mind being, but before many, of course, I thought things existed on there, outside of, and they do conventionally, of course, but it is my mind. But somehow we collectively decide a bicycle is a bicycle. That's amazing. I mean, anyway.
It is amazing, isn't it? Like, if you really start to contemplate that deeply.
I know. So we go, yeah, or is it? Well, I don't know, but I still have to keep thinking about.
Because I guess one point you would agree with, though, is that a bicycle is not a bicycle
Unless
from its own side without depending upon, in the bicycle's case, it's humans, right? Because only humans recognize bicycle.
Right.
So without, or maybe dogs do, I don't know, but mostly humans. I'm not sure if a dog knows what a bicycle is or not. That I wouldn't know, but mostly humans, right? Like, so without human beings' minds labeling it bicycle, it wouldn't be a bicycle.
Right. I mean, I agree. I get that.
So you can get to that there's no bicycle existing out there independent of the mind.
No, only conventionally, but not independent of the mind.
That would make sense. That would not make sense.
Well, we have to say conventional. We know it exists collectively. We know there's a bicycle. So it exists conventionally.
But I guess what we're getting is like how it exists, that it exists, or is the way, because we both agree, of course, everybody agrees the bicycle exists, but how it exists means it exists depending upon the mind.
Yeah.
That's clear.
That is.
So it's
how it exists also includes its function. It has a function, which does not include the wall or the pavement, right? There's a function for that composite.
Hmm.
Yeah, that's fair.
Dr. Lauren,
yeah.
Can I say something?
Yeah, sure.
So I'm thinking always of it as just the mind merely labels it. So like if you think that it always changes, like with innovation every day, there's always innovation, right? Someone comes up with something that didn't have a label before, and then you label it, all of a sudden it exists in everyone's minds, or if it's even accepted. Like if I, like people who label their cars with a name, right? This is my car and it's got a name. It actually, all of a sudden, it's got its own kind of different image for that person that you cannot see. Like we cannot all see, but that person all of a sudden has got this attachment to that car. That's kind of how I look at it. But actually, I just want to mention that it doesn't mean I totally understand it, but that's how I kind of
No, that's good.
understand it from my own perspective. But actually, my struggle actually is in the conventional, in that the conventional truth for me, actually, I'm saying, how does it exist if it always changes? Like that function. Sorry, my bird is like making noises with me. But so if it always changes, then how can it exist as a conventional truth? Like, so, you know how some people, they have like, you know, like people who hallucinate, like in their minds it really exists, right? So if like this person that can convince millions of people that something is true when it's not, right? Does that make it conventional truth for 40 million people, or is it not? You know what I mean? If that's what I'm struggling with, especially with what's happening today, that half of the country is totally different from the other half of the country, or right? So like, are those two conventional truths when we know that someone is really lying? You know, it's very difficult. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I totally get it. These are great questions, aren't they? And to me, what's important, I just want to say this too. I think what's important, the most important thing is asking these questions deeply and contemplating them deep. Like whether it's Cynthia's question, Linda's, all these questions, right? Like, you know, that's engaging with the material. So I want to say that's, you know, to me, that's great. In other words, so just asking these questions and contemplating them deeply and making it personal in this way that you guys are, and struggling with it in a real way, you know, that's better than being able to just say the words, right? Of, oh, everything is empty or whatever, you know, that's because it starts to affect, you know, the only way anybody ever realized it, you know, I gave the example last time of Pagmo, right? And how he kept asking people, what's the meaning of the object of negation? You know, and he kept asking the same question and contemplating it and struggling with it and not accepting what they said exactly, even if, you know, he accepted intellectually, but it didn't feel it, you know. So one point I want to say is it's good to ask these questions, to ask them over and over and really contemplate deeply. That's more important than just saying, oh, everything's merely labeled, okay, it's empty. That doesn't really do anything, does it? And then to go to Cynthia's point, like, you know, one is I sometimes think about that too lately, because it's, and I want to make a point about, I want to share like something, you know, one way Lama Tsongkhapa addresses that and from Chandrakirti's perspective, and then share a personal reflection about it. Like what, you know, so I'll say a few things. One is I gave this example, right? Like, you know, Chandrakirti makes a point, right? Like he says, if something, even if everybody says something is permanent, if it's impermanent, it's impermanent. There's one, you know, like there is all compounded phenomena are impermanent, right? And so like if, you know, so so, you know, I'll give an example. Like, so people might say America, you know, is the greatest country on earth and will last forever, right? Something like that. People talk like that, you know, and then, and Chandrakirti would say, I don't care if every single person in America says America will last forever. It won't last forever. Because things that come together due to causes and conditions, by their very nature, will end, right? So from one perspective, you could say Chandrakirti and, you know, Madhyamaka thinkers would say, it's an interesting point, isn't it? That, like, you know, their point, and that example would be, even if everyone believes something that's false, that doesn't make it true. And then they give, and then, so Lama Tsongkhapa, he goes deeply into this question, right? And he says, what makes a conventional truth, like, there's a point about like, they're conventional truths, all conventional truths are deceptive in the sense that they don't, they block us from, or they obscure us from seeing the ultimate truth, right? For ordinary people. But then that's a different question from, is it actually a conventional truth object, right? Does it exist conventionally or not, you know? And they sometimes give the example like the horns of a rabbit, right? A rabbit doesn't have horns, so those don't exist even conventionally. But then like Lama Tsongkhapa raises a question, which is like what you're getting at with hallucinations, right, Cynthia, is, well, how do you know? You know, in what way do they, And how do we know that? And what Lama Tsongkhapa says, and what Buddhist Majjhimaka philosophers say, is it can't, for something to exist conventionally, to be a valid conventional cognition, it has to, oh, sorry, I say this right. It can't be contradicted. In other words, not like, and there's a difference, it's an interesting point, isn't it? Like, it can't be contradicted by a subsequent valid cognition by the same person, and it also can't be contradicted by a valid cognition by another person. And this is subtle in a way, right? Because I want to give two different examples. This is my own reflection. I often think about this point, because I'm going to give the example first of all of peanut butter. Silly, right? Like for somebody who doesn't have a peanut allergy, right? They could say, "Oh, peanut butter." I look at peanut butter, and I say that's a very healthy food for me. Right? Somebody else who has a peanut allergy would look at peanut butter and say that will kill me. It's poison. In that case, they're both correct. Does that make sense? Like from their own perspective, from their own biology, like those are both conventionally true statements for the one person. So sometimes with certain objects, it depends upon the person's, what's the word? Context, right? In the example, I'm using a simplistic example of peanut butter, right? Like that's definitely true, isn't it? Like a child with peanut allergy, that could kill them. Whereas for another child, that's fine to have for lunch, peanut butter and jelly sandwich or something. But then to give a different example, right? Like, this is interesting, isn't it? Like, well, what's it called? I'll use I'll be provocative for a second, but following on what Cynthia said. If we say, but on the other hand, if somebody says hydrochloronique is an extremely effective treatment for everybody should take it to prevent coronavirus, right? Which is something that has been said by some politicians. That, right, is like, are all things impermanent, right? That's something knowable through, in this case, through like scientific experimentation, right? So they've done all, like I was reading yesterday, like they did all these different scientific studies. Somebody had said that, I'd seen somebody posting something about that. And so I went back and double checked. I was reading like the scientific, I was like, okay, I actually want to read the scientific research. And so I read like the most up-to-date summary of all the scientific studies. And I was like, no, they're really clear. It's not like, I was like, is it ambiguous? I didn't know. I'd sort of seen, I hadn't really read that. So I was like, I really want to see like, what's the most current actual scientific data? And I was like, and that's something knowable. But I actually want to share, just like this is my own reflection. I've often been thinking lately about like, I want to give a different example for a second, just because it gets at, I think, the heart of what you're getting at, Cynthia, in a way. I was actually thinking recently about Nixon, about Richard Nixon. And like, I'd read in some, I'd read this, that, in a few days before he resigned from office, right? Like a very high percentage of, in that case, well, he was Republican, right? So a very high percentage of Republican voters totally supported him and said he's truthful, he never lied, he didn't do anything illegal, he's a great president, and he should finish his term. And when I contemplated, I kept thinking about this. I was like, okay, then like a few days later, he resigned from office, right? It was and I thought to myself, well, like, I feel pretty certain that the vast majority of those people never stopped to say I was wrong. And that was disturbing to me. I actually felt very disturbed to contemplate that. I was like, wow, like, he eventually became totally clear, right, that he had lied. I mean, or now everybody accepts, like, Nixon lied, right? There's no question. But I thought, wow, a lot of the voters who supported him never really ever said, wow, I'm sorry, I was really wrong. And so were they right? you know, and my point is like what we have to be able to differentiate, I think, which is subtle, like, is there are some things that really are different from different people's point of views, like points of view, like peanut butter, right? That could be, you know, so there are things where different people can have a different perspective on it and they can both be valid. And then there are other things, whether it be like, you know, if somebody says America will last forever, right? Or if somebody says, you know, Richard Nixon never lied, where it's just false. That's not conventionally true, and it's not ultimately true. And what Lama Tsongkhapa would say about that, I was like, is that, you know, it's because, what's this right? No matter how many times that false thing would be said, it never was a valid conviction. It never was a valid perception, actually, right? And the more deeply you analyze it, even from a conventional point of view, the more you can come to understand it's false, right? And yeah, in Lama Zopa Rinpoche, I remember at Kopan, he gave the example of rebirth, you know, and he said like sometimes, you know, he was like, right, he's Tibetan, right? And he was teaching, and all these Western people would come to Kopan. And one time he was saying, he said, you know, sometimes Westerners come and everybody, like, you know, most of the audience say, I don't believe in rebirth. You know, and he said, like, you know, so then the majority, if you took a vote, the majority would say, no, there's no such thing as rebirth, right? And he said, but that has nothing to do with what's valid, right? Like, because it's not a valid cognition. In other words, like he said, like, he would say, because they don't know that, they never had a realization of that, they can't see that, it's a belief that they have, right? And they say, whereas a Buddha, if the Buddha, they say a Buddha, for example, can see the rebirth, right? They can actually see it directly. And he says, so if the Buddha's cognition of a direct perceiver sees rebirth and somebody else says there's no such thing as rebirth, well, the one is a belief based on no reasoning and no direct perception. They don't know. The other person actually sees it. Says that's a valid cognition, and it doesn't matter how many people. But it's still, in a way, I think, Cynthia, what you're getting at, though, is I think it's still disturbing, isn't it? Like, to realize, and I think it's actually a good reminder, I just want to say this one last point, like, for us, in terms of meditating on emptiness, right? Like, these things are good to think about, is one point, right? Like I said, but also, like, if you think about it from this perspective, I just want to say one more point, like, think about it from this perspective, right? Like, going back to Linda's example of the bicycle, right? Everyone who's, like, if you think of, like, how many people, I don't know, how many people in this country have seen emptiness directly? Very few, probably, you know, very, very few, I imagine, right? So, like, everyone, pretty much, like, or as you could say, almost everyone you've ever met, maybe if you met Khenpo Rinpoche, it might be an exception, or Dalai Lama or something, but everyone you've ever met, basically, says bicycles exist independent of the mind, intrinsically from their own side. And, like, if you were to take a vote on that, it would be actually 99.9%, you know. And that's incorrect. Like, bicycles don't exist that way. And that's just amazing, I think. Like, isn't it? Like, you know, and because what the Buddha is saying is, yeah, that the truth is knowable. But I think, you know, but it is subtle, right? To determine which things are like peanut butter, where it's two different two different correct valid cognitions from two different perspectives, and which things are false and always were false. You know, and that takes really a lot of contemplation and reasoning and thought. But I don't know if does that answer your, I don't know, I mean, it's not an answer, but does that sort of address the question? There's no, I'm not capable of answering that question really, but but does that at least address how to think about the question? So from a conventional point of view, actually, I'll just share one story. It just made me remember a story. Now I'm just being funny for a second, but one time, I'm a psychologist outside of, my job is psychology. And one time somebody came in, and the person was psychotic. They came in and they said to me, I'm Jesus Christ. And I remember this. I said, I was kind of like, well, that's not a good sign. But I started saying, I said, well, no, wait, your name is such and such. I said their name back to them. And they said, no, my name is Jesus Christ. And then I said, well, your parents seem to call you this other name. And, in my file, you're called this other name. And I've known you for a while and I've always called you that name. And everybody, whatever, it's on your birth certificate. And then the person said to me, well, actually, people are calling me Jesus Christ all the time. He said, the other day, somebody said, Jesus Christ, will you shut up? And then somebody else said, Jesus Christ, you're annoying. And then he said, so 3 or 4 different people have called me that. So now I'm convinced that, that's my name, because in the last week, 3 different people called me Jesus. And he gave 3 examples of that type. But that didn't make him Jesus. It's like it wasn't a valid cognition. He had misperceived their intent. But
I had a question, Marnie.
yeah.
I was thinking as Linda was talking about the difficulty, I think, of understanding the difference between the absolute and relative nature of existence of a bicycle, for example.
Yeah.
And I think I remember, that there's like the example of, say, a car, and analyzing, if you, is it this part, is it that part, and so forth. But
Right.
I think I remember that, is it usually easier to try to, at first, to try to use as the object of negation one's own self rather than some sort of external object or phenomenon? It's easier if you begin by meditating on your own sense of independent identity, isn't it?
What they actually, it's interesting. What they say is, it's interesting. What they actually say is, like, when presenting like an explanation of emptiness, like initially, like sort of, and you'll see this actually with Tibetan lamas, actually, like, and in Indian texts also. It's an interesting point. So what they say is, like, when explaining emptiness initially, they often use external objects. Tibetans are always using a vase, I noticed. Like, if you heard Tibetan Lama talk, they'll almost always talk about a vase. But Chandrakirti uses a chariot, which is very similar to a bicycle. And they sometimes say, like, I think Chandrakirti uses the example of a chariot, right? The parts of a chariot, verbally, to explain sort of how one contemplates, as he sort of is explaining it. Because the parts are sort of easy to see. It's like you can easily see the wheel, the seat, the whatever. But then what they say is exactly what you're saying, is that when it comes time to meditate and to realize emptiness, but they say, actually, it's an interesting point. They actually say this. They say everyone first realizes emptiness, or I think they say that, pretty much everyone, or everyone. That the process is that one actually realizes emptiness independent of the self, of the person, of your own person, and then of objects. And so it's interesting, they sometimes make that point in some of the, I've seen that in actual teachings, where they say, when explaining, they begin with objects and then go to the self. But in actual meditation practice, you first realize the emptiness of your own self, and then the emptiness of objects. So in that sense, you're correct. When it comes to actual meditation practice, you can contemplate the emptiness of objects and of yourself, but when it comes to really realizing it, they do say, they just in the commentary, one commentary I was reading yesterday to this text, the Tibetan Geshe said that that's the experience of all the yogis, the actual meditators, that when they talk about how the realization occurs, it's the first on the basis of one's own personal sense of self. So you're correct about that. But in explaining it, sometimes they'll use an example of an external object just because it's easier to see the parts, like, a vase, you have the, whatever,
spout, and so they'll sort of use some object they can hold up for the purpose of explanation, or Chandrakirti's case, it was a chariot. But you're right, when meditating, it's the personal self.
Thank you.
And Lynn, sorry. Oh, you have to. You want to unmute, or should I do it? Oh. Yeah, I
There you
unmuted.
go. Okay.
Yeah.
I have this strange experience that I think is sort of what you're talking about, because I have the same issue as Linda does, sort of, the composite parts. So I've only lived in old houses, since I've been an adult, okay? An old co-op apartment, now an old house. So I have these lights. There was one closet in both houses, or, places. It's the old gold little string that shuts the light on and off in the closet. Yeah. So, and neither of them worked well. They're both in closets in these houses, my house now and my co-op apartment. So you have to pull it a certain way in order to turn the light on, okay? So usually I go in and just jam it down and it won't work, right? And I'll try it a couple times, it won't work. And then I say, okay, what I'm gonna do is get in a meditative state and connect with the light. I know it sounds crazy, but I'm gonna go where the light is because the light's not coming to me. So I get in a very quiet meditative state. When I feel like I'm with the light, I go turn it on, and it goes one time and it turns on.
Ah.
So it's sort of a litmus test of where I am. If I'm in a space with this light, which, I always pictured it as going into the space where the light was, but maybe that's emptiness. Maybe that's where this light is.
Ah.
And it's interesting because it's sort of a metaphor for illumination, lighting up. And I've had experience with two of these lights now.
That's interesting.
So it's sort of how I picture, if you can get into an empty space yourself, you can realize emptiness. And then there's other things that are negated where you are. I can't quite get the full picture, but it's like being in a space where the light was. That's how I experienced it.
That's interesting. One is it does seem like an interesting metaphor, doesn't it? Especially given that it's light. But the other, I guess, one other reflection I have just personally about that, I don't know, I'm not sure, but one thought I have is it's really interesting, isn't it? Because even if I put myself in I've done things like that, I've had moments like that in life at times. I can't remember what context in that right now, but it's interesting, isn't it? Because it feels like, I'm me who's busy and the light's there, and then I'm going to go be with the light, right? It feels like the light's, and I think that experience, if you contemplate, if you start to, from a conventional perspective, whatever, it's the light, but if you, and we're not yet at the ultimate, but if you just start to go towards ultimate, if you start to ask an ultimate question, that's the way, they sometimes say ultimate analysis or something. So it's the beginning point of an ultimate analysis. That an experience like that can make one start to ask, well, again, this question I mentioned with Linda, which is just a question, right? But it's an ultimate question, is, well, how does the light exist? And in what sense is there a separate light and a separate me for me to be with the light?
Right.
And are those, my experience when I first walk in the closet, if I'm you, right, is of course there's a me and there's a light in the closet, and we're not the same, I'm not the light and the light's not me. But that experience makes one start to ask that question. In what way is there a light out there and a me over here that I can then be with the light? Or are those categories really real?
And the only way this light gets turned on is if I get quiet and contemplative and give up control over the light. That's the only way this works. I can get on the light in the closet.
It's pretty funny.
So it's sort of like the causal connections. I've always thought the causal connections to turning on the light are different than what you think conventionally. In other words, you think you pull the string and the light goes on. Well, that doesn't work for me. So I have to get in this state where I'm in a different contemplative, quiet state, and then I can, I don't know, I'm someplace that could cause the light to go on.
Yeah. Wow. Does it ever happen without pulling the string? That where you can just do that and then it just comes on? You still have to pull it also.
So, but I mean, it's the feeling that there is some causal connection between my state of mind, you know, if your mind is thinking about the light in a certain way, and then it stops, thinks about the light in a different way, you can illuminate the situation. I guess that's what I'm saying. Well, really, because, you know, you're turning on a light.
I like the double use of, yeah, illuminate's a good word. That's interesting. That's great. I mean, and again, like I just want to point out, like all these, you know, it's just good to be asking questions, you know, like, and we often don't ask. And I want to say one more point, you know, it gets back to a number of points people have made, but I do want to make this point also just to remember is that, like, you know, this whole point about conventional truth and ultimate truth, that, wait. You know, sometimes they say conventional truth is not analyzed, but it can be analyzed conventionally. You know, like there are conventional questions, right? Does, you know, is peanut butter good for this particular child? Is a very important practical question if it's your child and you think they have an allergy, right? So it's not that there's no analysis, but that's clearly not an ultimate question, right? That's a conventional question. But my point is like, ultimate truth is, you know, this is a particularly a Prasangika Madhyamaka point, but that the whole question of ultimate truth, you know, begins with ultimate, they call it ultimate, I think the translators, I like this, they call it ultimate analysis. And what that means is asking a question about the ultimate status of something. You know, and as long as if you're asking like, where are my glasses? That's not a, you know, that's a conventional question, right? Or what's for dinner? You know, that's not an ultimate question, you know. But if you start to ask the question, in what way does the bicycle exist, right? Using Linda's point, like, you know, and does it exist? Does it really exist as a collection of things? And can something exist as a collection apart from the mind or independent of the mind, right? That's an ultimate question anyway. That's not an ultimate answer yet, but that's an ultimate question. You know, and that's the beginning, I guess, because what Chandrakirti is getting at in part is that you can only come to ultimate truth. The ultimate truth is an experience, right? Of empty, a direct experience. They say actually, you know, the actual experience of ultimate truth is a direct realization of emptiness. But we only ever get there by starting to ask questions about the ultimate status of things, right? In what way does a bicycle exist? If it's a collection of parts, if it's a conglomerate or a collection, you know, how does a collection exist? You know, and is there such a thing as a collection that exists from its own side, independent of the mind, right? And if something depends on the mind, then does it exist from its own side or not? And my point is like, these are questions that we, you know, that when you start asking those questions, you, that's the process of moving towards ultimate truth. And then I wanted to, I've said this before, but I'll just bring it up now in this context, is there's a very famous quote from Aryadeva, from Aryadeva's 400 stanzas on emptiness, where he points out, he says like, you know, the actual phrase I think is something like, you know, even a mere doubt about emptiness tears samsara to shreds, you know, is his quote. And what he's getting at there, I think, you know, is a really important point. If you think deeply about what is Aryadeva saying, you know, he's not saying, obviously he's not saying this. He's not saying like if you go to a class about emptiness and you go, well, I don't know what this, I doubt this, or something, I don't know what they're talking about. That's not what he's saying. What he's saying, when he says even a mere doubt about this, he's getting it at this process we're talking about, which is, in other words, if you yourself, what Aryadeva is saying is, if you yourself start asking ultimate question, a question about the ultimate status of how things exist, their self, as Alex mentioned, or an object like a bicycle, and if you start to go, like if you, let's say that using the example of the bicycle, I'm just picking that as an example because it's for discussion, right? But usually say, well, bicycle, you say, well, bicycles exist. Right? And then you say, well, they seem to exist out there independently, but they're a collection of parts. Then you say, well, collection can exist without the mind, right? Because the mind is part of labeling that a collection. And as Jeff said, that's partly on function, but it's partly on, convention, it's partly on society, whatever, all the language, right? And then you start to say, well, so bicycles only exist dependent upon my mind. And then you start, and if you come to a point where you say, well, so then they don't exist outside of my mind, right? And then you might say, well, then does that mean like the mind only school says, right? The mind only school would say that that there's no external object independent of the mind, right? That the mind and the perceiver and the perceived are of one entity. There's no external object that exists as a different entity than my mind. Or does it mean that the bicycle exists, but it exists dependent upon the label, which is not how it appeared, right? And if you come to a point where you start to have doubts like that, does that make sense? Where you're actually asking those questions deeply in your own experience and you start to go, maybe things really don't exist independently. Maybe things really don't exist from their own side, right? And you start to have doubts and really seriously feel that. That's what he's getting. He's saying when you have that experience, that tears samsara to shreds because you're starting to head towards, you haven't yet realized, he's getting at the point, he's saying just a doubt, right? He's saying you haven't yet realized emptiness. But that's the process, right? And then you go more and more deeply into those questions. And what Aryadeva is saying is that's the process, right? You ask those questions, you ask them more deeply, you continue asking them. And if you don't give up on the process, eventually you yourself will come to some kind of experience of emptiness. But everybody, and that's really important. What Aryadeva is getting at in a way is that for everybody, it starts with doubts. So that's why I'm encouraging when people say, I have doubts about this, it doesn't make sense, or what's the nature of conventional truth and what's the nature of ultimate truth? And, can something exist as a collection and ultimately exist that way or not? And, and are there conventional truths then? How do they, in what way is a conventional truth true? That these are the right questions, and that it's like more and more deeply engaging with those questions. At least what Aryadeva is saying is that's how you eventually realize emptiness. So that's why it tears samsara to shreds. It's not because just the doubt by itself does. It's because the doubt's part of a process.
Lauren?
Yeah.
Could you just, you said something to contemplate is if it depends on the mind, does it exist on its own side? Did I get that right? I mean, I think that might be my contemplation.
Yeah, that's a valid question. That's an important question.
You said it. Not.
That's a really important question.
Is that the way I should think about it?
If it depends on my mind, then does it exist from its own side? Yeah.
That's a good contemplation for me. Okay. I'll get.
Yeah, and actually, I'll share one other point. Actually, like just yesterday, I was also looking. I've been slowly making my way through a book by Lama Tsongkhapa about the perfection of wisdom, but he makes a point that, which is, I think, getting at some. I mean, you guys are raising good questions today. Oh wow! Actually, it's funny. I had all this material prepared. What we're using. We'll get to that today, most of it, but which is fine. But Yeah. So Lama Tsongkhapa makes this really interesting point where he's talking about, actually it's a section where he's talking about, there is a section, the Prajnaparamita Abhisamaya Alamkara, it's called, the Ornament for Clear Realizations. So it's his commentary on Maitreya's text about the Prajnaparamita. But anyway, so the Abhisamaya Alamkara, Maitreya says there are different types of practitioners. And he says some have, he says some have sharp faculties and some have dull faculties. And I'll just pause. I've often, sometimes when I would go to some teachings in New York by Ken Rinpoche, I had some friends, and they would come up and go, "So are you a sharp faculty or a dull faculty?" Or, you know, like some kind of joke. And I would think, "Oh, I'm not quite either yet." I think it's my fear. But one thing that's really interesting is Lama Tsongkhapa makes this clear distinction where he says dull faculty, you know, and in a way, I mean, dull is not bad. Whereas dull faculty would be good. It would be good to be a dull faculty practitioner, because dull faculty practitioners gain realizations also. But what he says actually, which is interesting, is he says dull faculty practitioners from this perspective, which not dull seems like an insulting word, but it's not actually. It's not intended. Like they mean like sharp, like a knife, like very sharp, like a very sharp knife, or like a less sharp knife or something. You know, what he says is what Tsongkhapa says is he says the less sharp faculty practitioners, you know, just have faith. Like, you know, somehow they have some karmic connection, and when the Buddha, they study from a Buddha or they study from a great Lama, they just have some kind of faith and they practice, you know, and that's good. They progress. Then he makes this point. He says, whereas sharp faculty practitioners have more doubts. Actually, they don't accept it. They say that doesn't make sense. I don't understand that. And they ask a lot of questions, and they sort of, and what he says is that those practitioners, you know, at the beginning they have less seeming faith. He says, but because they ask questions, if they ask those questions deeply and more deeply and more deeply, and they don't give up on asking those questions. And and he points out, he says, so those practitioners in the end progress more quickly. That's all. Like, so both can achieve enlightenment. But he makes this point. He says the person who has doubts and who asks questions and who contemplates and who like looks at it from many angles and sort of says, you know, well, I'm not sure about that, and why is that true, and so on. They'll both progress and they'll both achieve enlightenment, is his point. But he says the sharp faculty one who has more doubts and more questions at the beginning actually progresses more quickly in the end, because they develop a faith. When they develop faith, it's unshakable because it's come about through reasoning, you know, and through analysis of their own, not through a deep analysis on their own part. And so they kind of develop a kind of deep conviction, which then leads them to practice in a very intensive way with an absolute commitment, because they've realized it through their own process in a way. And so they kind of practice with a fierceness and a clarity that's even more intense, and therefore they achieve enlightenment more quickly, is his point. So I just thought that was interesting. So it's getting it, you know, that it's good. I guess all I'm saying is it's good to ask questions and think about these things. And even Gyume Khyentse Rinpoche said that once when he was teaching. Some of you, I don't know, if Jeff, you were probably there, and Dondrup, and a few other people. Gabe was probably there. But one time he was saying he said, part of the practice, you know, of the 6 perfections, the Prajnaparamita, right, the perfection of wisdom was the 6th, right? That's we're studying Prajnaparamita, perfection of wisdom. And he said part of the practice of the perfection of wisdom is asking questions, you know, and contemplating questions, and, you know, so the process of questioning, he said, that's part of your practice of the, you know, the realization of Prajnaparamita is a realization of emptiness. But the practice of the Prajnaparamita, part of that is study, but part of it is asking questions and wondering about things and going to lamas and asking questions, or looking up answers in books and in class discussing these things. So this is actually part of the practice of the perfection of wisdom, if we're analyzing these things together. Anyway, so with that, other questions or comments?
I have one other question.
Either, yeah.
Lauren, I have one question, just if we can go back to the image of negation. Let's take the self. When you read text, they say that it appears independent of the body and mind, or above, something above and beyond. But whenever I think about myself or any other object, but let's take myself, for example, my body and mind are appearing as. So I'm not sure if I'm misunderstanding something, or if I'm just getting when my image is too general, but.
No, I think, tell me if this answers it, I'm not sure, but like for most people, when they first start to try to identify the object of negation, it appears, inside their body. Like in other words, sometimes they'll say my chest or my head or my throat,
Yeah.
So that's very normal. And when they say like something, how do you say separate from, or what was the phrase you used?
Independent of, or like that there's something, well, in Fabon Kappa in Liberation of the Palm of Your Hand says above, or,
Yeah, I get it. I think what they're not saying like above spatially. I think what they're getting at is like, because sometimes they'll say this, like sometimes, or is it, how to say this the right way? I think what they're getting at in the meaning, at least is my opinion, is that, because usually it appears, experientially it appears like, it feels like it's in your body. That's normal. But that there are times where like, where it seems like above, maybe more like, where it appears to us as separate from, and I'll give an example of what I mean. Like, like initially it'll appear as if it's here, right? But then like, if you were to say, there are other times where experientially, where you feel, I'm trying to think how to say this the right way, like, where you feel, it really feels like my body, and then when you're saying my body, right, like, actually, sometimes I remember this, the Dalai Lama gives an example where he says, if you said to somebody, like if you said to a person, oh, do you want, if you had he makes up a fictional scenario, right, where he says, if like there came a point in scientific development, right, where somebody could come to you and say, hey, listen, do you want to keep this body, or do you want like an extremely healthy, attractive 28-year-old body, or 25-year-old body, but you can keep all your knowledge and your learning and your personality, but do you want to trade it in? That the ordinary person, if you were asking an ordinary person, they would say, yeah, sure. Like, especially as you get older, right? If you start to have health problems and things, where you would say, well, yeah, if I can keep all my memories and my personality, sure, I'd trade it in. As if there's some self that exists apart from the body. And then in the same way, right? Like sometimes I've had this experience where you see somebody else who's more, like, who has a very sharp mind, and you think, oh, I wish I had a mind like them. I'd like to have that mind. I'd like to have a mind like they have. As if there's an I separate from the mind that could have that other mind. And so I think when they're saying like above or apart from, it's that feeling where you feel like I would trade in my body, or you feel like, and there are times even in daily life where you feel like, where you could almost feel like, oh, why is my mind like this, right? My mind is sad today. Why is it like that? I wish it were different, where you almost have this feeling as if there's an I separate from the mind that somehow exists apart. But of course you're thinking that. So it is the mind thinking that. But so it's that kind of experience where you sort of feel, I think that's what he's getting at, is these moments that we have sometimes where our experience of the self seems almost distant from our body or distant from our mind. But still, usually our experience of the self is, arises kind of, it's not like literally spatially above. It's more like a feeling. But there is sometimes a feeling like that where you feel like, why is my mind like this? As if there's an I separate from the mind, or oh, why is my body so sluggish, today, or something, where it almost feels like there's an I looking at the body, and sort of as if the body were like a horse or something, that you like. There's some kind of moments where where you can feel like that. You can feel like there's an I looking at the body and going, why is my body like that today? This is annoying me or something. But I think it's getting at that.
I mean, sometimes out of the corner of my eye, I'll catch a feeling in it, and a picture of like, but my body is still there, of something covering it. You know what I mean? Like
an eye,
it, so to speak. Or sometimes if it's an emotion, I'll feel the emotion, the I in the emotion in the body. Yeah. But I'm still got a picture of my body in there. You know what I mean? Yeah. Maybe just a sloppy version, but it's still, does that?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Even as you say, my body, it's like, if you think of, Chandrakirti's sevenfold analysis of the chariot, actually, which is in the Majjhima Avatar, he goes through that where he said, like, sometimes it seems like the I is in the body. He's actually getting at different states. And then he says, sometimes it feels, and with the my, sometimes it feels like the I is the owner of the body, and sometimes it seems like, sometimes we identify with one part of the mind, and then sometimes it seems like we own the mind, or like or we exist within the aggregates, and those are all normal. I guess my point is like, part of, I think, what Chandrakirti is getting at there is that, we don't actually, and this is part of ultimate analysis again, isn't it? Is where you're looking for the object of negation. It appears in different ways in different moments. That's the corner of your eye thing, which I think I like that. Where you said it is like, you'll start to notice it appears differently in different moments. But it always seems to, but what, from a Majjhimic perspective, they would say it always seems to exist inherently from its own side. But it has different, it appears in different aspects at different moments where, sometimes, and you can see that, right? Where sometimes you see, like, sometimes if somebody hit me, right, I would say, you hit me, and I would feel that. They hit me, as if I am the body, right? Like, as if right, by saying you hit me when they hit my body, it would be like, I am my body, you hit me, right? And then there are other times where it's like, I really feel more like, oh, my body is getting older or something, right? Where it seems like there's an I separate from the body then. And so those are just that, even our use of language implies those are two different ways that the I can appear to us. One is like, you hit me, as if I'm totally identified with the body, and the other, my body, as if there's an owner, or as if there's an owner of the body. And it's like, like as if I would say, oh, my car is getting older, and also my body's getting older, as if there's something I own, and as if there's an I separate. And the language gets at different ways the sense of self appears to us, I think. But is there more that?
So it can change.
Yeah, it does change, yeah.
And we're trying to get at that. Well, sometimes it's a feeling, but sometimes it's an image of that. Well, I'm going to use the word separateness, but that independence that we're feeling, that there's actually something there. Or even if we look at a carpet and we see carpet, we're seeing some carpetness in the carpet, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
Yeah, and we're trying to catch that.
Yes.
It happens very fast, though.
Yeah.
Well, at least for me, anyway.
Yeah, no, and they say that's the hardest part. They often say that the hardest part of meditating on emptiness is to really, in your own experience, especially to identify what you're getting at, which I think is the innate. They say it's not the intellectually acquired sense of self. It's that innate sense of self, that sense of grasping at a carpet or at an eye, that's instinctive, or that's sort of, that was there when we were a baby, that's there at the moment we're dying. It's that very instinctive kind of grasping, and it's sometimes hard. Yeah, they say that it's hard to catch, or it's hard to hold on to, and to really notice, how do I do that? So I think you're right.
Thank you.
Yeah, Alex had something.
You said earlier that the meaning of emptiness and dependent arising in the Madhyamaka are kind of synonymous. And I'm wondering if, from the point of view of the other philosophical schools, would they argue that that's not true, or is it more that they just sort of didn't reach that that point?
Good question. Wow, you guys are all asking good questions. Everybody's asking good questions today. But so one thing is, like, the others, it's interesting, isn't it? Like, in one way, all Buddhist schools do talk about dependent arising, but they have a different meaning. Actually, it's interesting. It's like, from other Buddhist schools' perspectives, they would talk about it. There is the meaning of dependent arising. I was saying earlier, like, there are three levels. Sometimes we talk about three levels of dependent arising. One is causal, the other is parts, and the other is label, right? Labeling. Like, so what's interesting is all Buddhist schools, so if you think of the 12 links of dependent arising, like, that's one teaching of the Buddha, and all Buddhist schools teach that. All Buddhist schools agree that there's a teaching of the Buddha, the 12 links of dependent arising. They're shown in the wheel of life, right? The 12 links. So from that perspective, all Buddhist schools would say there is such a thing as dependent arising, but they would, I guess the point would be like, if you think of the Prasangika Madhyamaka perspective, when they talk about the most subtle level of dependent arising, which is labeling, right? That one. Other Buddhist schools would not say that. They would disagree with that. They wouldn't say that, so like if you take like the, I'll give a very simplistic, go back to the least subtle of all the Buddhist schools, the Vaibhashikas. Yeah, Vaibhashikas. Like, so they would say like, because they would actually agree about, they would say, if you said, in what way does a personal self exist, right? They would say, well, it exists dependent upon the 5 aggregates. So they would agree it's dependently arisen, but they would say, I'll give an example. Like they would say, but the 5 aggregates themselves do exist inherently. That form has a kind of inherent existence in partless particles, that consciousness has a kind of inherent existence in partless moments. And they would say those things don't exist merely labeled by the mind. They are truly existent, and they are, so they would say things are dependently arisen. Like they would say, for example, birth depends upon, like they would agree that with causal dependence, that due to ignorance and mental afflictions and karma, on the basis of those causes, a being takes rebirth. They would agree that's dependent arising, but they wouldn't say that. But they would not say, they would, first of all, they wouldn't agree with the subtle level of dependent arising taught by the Madhyamaka. And also, actually, they would just say, right? Yeah, so they would not say, though, that, let me say it the right way. From their perspective, certain things do have inherent existence and true existence, and those things do not merely depend upon the mind, for example. They wouldn't agree with that. But does that answer your question, or is there more to your question?
I'm thinking that what you're saying in the context of this early Buddhist understanding would be it's more dualistic, or there's a sense of no self,
Mm-hmm.
but there's not so much a sense of emptiness of external phenomena.
That's exactly right. Yeah, they refute like a what's it called? Like a solitary, sort of singular, independent, substantially existent self of persons. They would say, that in that sense, there's a kind of selflessness. They would say that, but you're right. They don't talk. From their perspective, external objects and also consciousness, they don't talk about. They would not say those are empty. They don't think about the emptiness. So they would say that's not a relevant question. Even that all that matters is that there's no substantially existent, independent self of persons. And if you said to them, like, well, how about the ultimate status of external objects or consciousness, they would say that's not a relevant question. Even that wasn't. They would say all that to achieve arhatship, you just have to realize the selflessness of persons. That's all that matters, and these other questions are not relevant. So you're right. Yeah, they don't talk about that. They don't analyze that even. Yeah, and so that only the 2 Mahayana schools talk about the emptiness of external objects, for example. The mind-only school and the Madhyamakas. Only they even talk about that, or accept that view. And and also and so if you think about it, and only the Madhyamakas really go to that last, only they emphasize that last level of dependence, the dependence upon label. That one is an emphasis of the Madhyamaka school. Whereas all Buddhist schools accept causal dependence. So if you think from dependent arising, all Buddhist schools would accept that things arise due to causes and conditions, but only them, but the particular focus of the Madhyamakas is depends upon labeling. But yeah, other comments? Wow. I know we have like 15 minutes. One comment I'll make is what a fun, that was not what I expected. What a fun class though. What a fun discussion. To really just sort of engage with the material together. It's really fun. And maybe with the last, 15, 60 minutes, 70, whatever, so one point is I'll wait till next, today, one thing I was gonna start in on, which we won't do today, we'll do next time, is that the next paragraph where it says, all phenomena are emptiness without characteristics, unproduced, unceased, stainless, not without stain, not deficient, not fulfilled. That's a big topic, actually, that paragraph. So we'll get to that next time. But with the last few minutes, I do want to go back to the paragraph we were on and just say a few things about that. Because after Avalokiteshvara, right, last time we focused on this phrase, form is empty, emptiness is form, emptiness is not other form, form also is not other emptiness. There is another sentence, right, in that paragraph where Avalokiteshvara says, in the same way, feeling, discrimination, compositional factors, and consciousness are empty, right? And so I just want to say, I'll say a few things about that sentence. So what they say is that Avalokiteshvara starts with form because, first of all, that's in the list of the five aggregates, that's the first, right? So he focused on that. And also because one commentary made this point, it said, also because for us, it's oftentimes in relation to forms, right? That we develop our attachment and aversion, our anger, most of our anger and most of our grasping are at forms, right? Whether it be other people, right? We get angry at them or we grasp at them, or, objects that we want, things that we are jealous of, objects that we want, objects that we don't want, objects we're upset with. So he focuses on form partly because it's the first of the five aggregates, partly because it's the thing that we tend to grasp at particularly strongly. But then in the second sentence, he's pointing out that all the other four aggregates, you would apply the same phrasing, right? So you could also say, feeling is empty, emptiness is feeling, emptiness is not other than feeling, and feeling is also not other than emptiness, right? You can do the same thing with discrimination or compositions or factors or consciousness. So again, even with consciousness, you could say consciousness is empty, emptiness is consciousness. Emptiness is not other than consciousness. Consciousness also is not other than emptiness. So I just want to point that point out, that the fourfold emptiness that we covered last time, it would be appropriate, and what that last sentence is saying is, in the same way, right, they're empty. And when he says they're also empty, he means that fourfold emptiness would apply to all the other aggregates as well. Does that make sense? And so, just want to make this point, like in your own contemplations, there are a number of things that I want to say about, while we have a few minutes about that paragraph. So on one level, in meditating on that paragraph, right, you could look for going back to what Alex asked earlier, right? And if you're a practitioner who's doing meditation, on one level, you could look for your own I, right? That Varahi was talking about, right? Your sense of self. Right? So one way you could kind of look for find your own object of negation, which is your grasping at, or the object you grasp at, right? Which is a truly existent self or an inherently existent self. And then you could, just like we were doing with the bicycle, right? Now you could do it in relation, you would give rise to that sense of your sense of I that seems to exist inherently from its own side. And then you could search the parts, right? These are the parts that, that you label I on, which is the form, feeling, discrimination, composition, factor, and consciousness. And you could search those and you would say, does the I exist, somewhere separate from those? No, right? As the I never appears somehow with no body and no mind, then if it did, right, then I could you know, I could look at empty space, like I could look, you know, at the empty space and then say, oh, that's Linda here. That doesn't make any sense at all, right? But then you would analyze, does it exist on the parts of the eye, right? So from one perspective, you could do that in relation to your sense of self. But then also, as we did last time with form, you could go through each of the 5 aggregates and recognize that they're empty of it. In one sense, they're empty of a self of persons, right? In other words, none of them are you. But then from another perspective, you can analyze them and recognize that they're also empty, like form is empty. Like I said last time, water is empty of being water from its own side, right? And we did that whole analysis of the atomic and subatomic structure of water. But you could do the same thing with feeling, right? And we have time. I'll just briefly go through what do I mean by that, right? And so, right, we talked about this when we went over what are the 5 aggregates, right? So feeling means like pleasurable feeling or unpleasant feeling or neutral feeling, right? In this context, that's Buddhist definition of feeling. You know, that word feeling, it means that, right? It's a very basic level. And why does the Buddha emphasize that? Because one is that's always present in our mind. You know, we always are feeling either neutral, positive, or that things are neutral, positive, or pleasant or unpleasant. And based on that, we give rise to attachment and aversion, right? Samsara, you know, and then that leads to our samsara, you know, karma, which leads to suffering. So here, you know, so it's interesting, isn't it? Like, so I'm going to give the example of a pleasant feeling, right? So a pleasant feeling seems like it's real, right? It seems like it has its own true existence. And you know, part of the proof of that is that we'll do all kinds of things to give rise to them, right? We live our whole lives, right? We have jobs and we collect money and we try to get relationships and we try to get houses and because we want to have pleasant feelings, right? So like our whole life is driven by the quest for pleasant feelings, actually, right? Pretty much everything we do actually is driven by that. And if you were going to meditate on the emptiness of, you know, and when we give rise to when a pleasant feeling arises, right? We grasp at it and we feel, first of all, it's real and I want more of it. Right? But then if you were going to analyze, and then, you know, so then you would actually look at that sense. So you'd have to find the object of negation, right? In this case, right, if you were going to do feeling, right, because you could go through any of the 5 aggregates and meditate on emptiness, you would have to, again, though, first find the object of negation, right? Which is that the pleasant feeling appears to be real and exists from its own side, right? As a truly existent thing, that feeling seems to be there, right? Just like water seems to be there in the form one, this pleasant feeling seems to really exist, right? And again, you'd have to really think, wow, like from one perspective, I don't know, maybe we've never thought about that. But if you start to think about it, you start to recognize, wow, yeah, like, you know, I do all kinds of things, right? People do all kinds of things, right? It's like, why do people rob banks, right? It's because they want a pleasant feeling, right? It seems that real to them, right? Why do people kill somebody? They think they're blocking, you know, actually you feel that. This person's blocking me from having a pleasant feeling. I would murder them, right? It's like, it seems that real that you would do anything, actually. People do all kinds of things, right? People like spend decades, you know, sort of working on projects because they think it'll give them a pleasant feeling. Right? And people do, you know, actually, like, it's weird, right? Most times when people break a law, right? It's to get a pleasant feeling. Like, so things seem that real. Does that make sense? The pleasant feeling seems so real at first you may not think about it, but if you think deeply, you start to realize, wow, like, I view pleasant feelings as like incredibly real, actually. You know, and then in what way, you know, and then you would do it. So you'd have to find the object of negation, which is the pleasant feeling that seems to exist intrinsically or be real or exist from its own side. And then you would, what's the word? Actually, and with pleasant feeling, it's quite easy in a way. If you think, so you think about then you would think about how it is dependently arisen, right? And And it's weird, actually. I'm just pausing and thinking about it, right? Like, you know, I'm trying to think, I'll pick which example. Like so in the, like, I'll give a simple example, a very simplistic example. Like if you were, I was going to use going to the beach, but maybe I'll use, yeah, I'll just use that, right? If we're, if, you know, whatever. If somebody's on a hot summer, because it's summertime, right? So if it's a hot summer day and somebody goes to the beach, right? And like, especially like a lot of times, at least yeah, on this coast, right? You hit traffic on the way to the beach. Anytime in the summer, right? If you go in the summer, usually you hit traffic. And so like, and so actually like you're having an unpleasant feeling, right? Of sitting in traffic. And especially if it's like a fairly long drive, right? I'll just give you an example, right? So you're having an unpleasant feeling, right? Maybe you're feeling like cramped in the car and so on. And then maybe you get there and maybe you have to find parking or whatever, right? And so there's this unpleasant feeling. And then like you get out of the car, you finally get there and you park, you get out of the car and you look and you go, ah, oh, I'm here, right? And you look at the sand and the water, and then a pleasant feeling arises, right? And actually you did all that driving like for that feeling, right? You went through, and maybe you spent a lot of money like for that feeling, right? That's really the reason you spend, like maybe you spend, actually depending where you go, you could spend huge amount of money, right? And a lot of effort to get there. And then, you know, you have this moment where you look and you say, ah, right? And then there's the pleasant feeling, right? And that seems to exist from its own side, right? Really, it seems to be real, right? And part of the analysis here is actually what's funny, isn't it? Like that pleasant feeling, first of all, like what's it, you know, you could say, actually you could see dependent arising, right? First of all, actually one way, in one sense, it only exists in dependence upon the previous unpleasant feeling. Isn't that weird, actually? Like, yeah, because partly pleasant feelings depend, like, yeah, that particular pleasant feeling, right? Partly arises because, you know, and then it arises in dependence upon all kinds of things, right? Like what is water, right? Which we analyzed last time doesn't truly exist. And then sand, which doesn't truly exist, right? If you could, there's silica, right? Like if you analyze ultimately the status of sand, there is no ultimately existent water. We went through that, right? Salt, you know, the molecular structure of that too. Sand, you know, that, right? And then it depends upon like all kinds of things, right? An eye consciousness that's perceiving light, an ear consciousness that's maybe hearing the sound of waves, right? It's depending upon a mental consciousness and upon labeling, right? Like that you label, oh, this is good, right? Like you have some positive label or positive association, I guess, maybe, right? Otherwise you wouldn't spend money to go to the beach, you'd spend money to go somewhere else, right? So in dependence upon all, like many different factors, like actually you label something positive, right? And then, and depends upon all those things, like, so the water, which is not truly existent, the sand, which is not truly existent, the sound, which is just waves, right? You know, those are not truly existent. Light waves, you know, reflecting off, whatever, all these different things, right? And then consciousness, right? And then labeling. So then a pleasant, you know, so then there's an appearance of a pleasant feeling, right? And the idea here is it's a mere appearance, right? Which has no, what's the word? Intrinsic existence. Right? And actually another way of getting at that too is it's a mental factor, right? There are many mental factors that arise. And the main mind is perceiving maybe the beach at that moment, right? Your mind is going, oh, that's the beach, right? And then there's an independence upon that main mind perceiving that, there's this mental factor of pleasant feeling. So it's not, you could see, actually, if you contemplate it, you can start to see, right, that pleasant feeling, does it exist conventionally? Of course it does, right? It's a conventionally existent phenomena, you know, but how does it exist? And again, it's very clear, isn't it? It's dependently arisen. And in dependence upon many factors, there's an appearance, right? And last thing before we stop, I'll just say this, like, so you start to get this sense, like, it's, you know, that's where you get the examples, you know, of illusion, right? There are all these examples in Buddhism, right? Like an illusion, you know, and you start to see, wow, it's just, you know, because an illusion, what is that, right? Like, it was like, if you think of how does somebody produce an illusion, they put together different things to make something look a certain way, but it doesn't actually exist that way, right? So in other words, due to all these different factors, there's a mere appearance of a moment of pleasant feeling, right? And pleasant feeling is always momentary, isn't it, too? There is, it's just in one moment, right? Because actually, then if somebody, like, if you had that, if you were standing at the beach looking out and you had this momentary pleasant feeling, and right then, like, let's say the car behind you, somebody jammed on their horn because they were mad at the other driver, the next instant you would have an unpleasant feeling, wouldn't you? Dependent upon that sensation, right? If they were right behind you and they jammed on their horn, then for certain, right, almost certainly, like most people, almost everybody, immediately they would have an unpleasant feeling, right? So you start to see there's no truly existent pleasant feeling. It's like an illusion, actually, right? It's like dependent upon these different factors of light and sound and consciousness and labeling. There's this momentary appearance of a pleasant feeling, and it really is like an illusion, right? Like if you change one factor, the sound part, immediately you would have an unpleasant feeling. So there's nothing truly existent. There's nothing existent from its own side in the pleasant feeling. It exists in this kind of very ephemeral way, and it has no existence from its own side, right? It's just sort of it exists through many different causal factors, and one of them is labeling, right? And my point is like, so you could, all I'm getting at, because we have to stop, is you could do that analysis with regard to any of the other aggregates. So you could analyze the self and recognize there is no self of persons in the aggregates, or you can analyze any given aggregate and recognize that, as Avalokiteshvara says, it's also empty of inherent nature, or empty. It's empty, right? So the aggregate, each aggregate is also itself empty of intrinsic existence. And that's the meaning of that last sentence of that paragraph. So I just wanted to say that, because that way we, what I'm going to do next time, that was a point about that paragraph. So next time, what we'll spend time on is the following paragraph. So the all phenomena are emptiness without characteristic, and so on. And what I wanted to just suggest, just if you're willing to continue kind of working with the material on your own, is I think it's great that people are doing that. And so just to really keep asking these questions, and I think the questions people raised today were really interesting. So to keep asking those kinds of questions, so to keep looking at real life examples, again, whether it's your glasses or the car or the bicycle or your house, or yourself, is to keep looking at these questions, right? Like, how do I exist? Do I exist independent of labeling? Do I exist as a collection? If so, how? And to think about what is dependent upon causes, dependent upon parts, dependent upon labeling. Is there anything there that exists from its own side as that thing? Does that make sense? So just to keep doing that in relation to different objects. I gave the example of the rug in our house. So to do that in relation to yourself or in relation to external objects, but just to keep kind of contemplating that, because again, like Arya Davis said, right? If you contemplate that experientially, not just intellectually, but in a real way, and you ask those questions, those are ultimate questions, right? You're starting to ask the question of ultimate truth. And if you develop doubt, that's where you start to tear samsara to shreds, right? That's a process that eventually leads to realizing emptiness. So anyway, that's my suggestion, is just to keep experimenting with that. And then next time we'll go into the next paragraph of the sutra. But we should do the dedication. The supreme jewel bodhicitta, where it has not arisen, may it arise and grow. Where it has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. In the snowy mountain paradise, you the source of good and happiness, all-powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. Well, thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lord.
Do we have?
Thank you.
Oh, yeah. So I guess next class is in I think in 2 weeks, right? It's not next week; it's in 2 weeks. So yeah, I'll see you guys in a couple weeks.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you, Lauren.